Londonderry is famous for a remarkable siege. But there's an extraordinary time in the city's more recent past that's been forgotten. The years when Derry was at the centre of World War II's longest and most decisive battle. The Battle of the Atlantic. To reveal this story, we begin not in the city, but on the waters off its coast. Out there, on the horizon, hidden deep beneath the waves, lie hundreds of forgotten shipwrecks. Together, they tell the story of an extraordinary conflict. It lasted nearly 6 years. 100,000 men died and 4,000 ships were sunk. Wrecks from the battle still litter the seabed here. Lost, forgotten and out of reach until now. One underwater explorer has compiled a unique map. It charts the lost wrecks of the Battle of the Atlantic. Now he and a team of expert divers are going in search of them to uncover the lost stories of the battle.
All the hatches are closed, and there's an open locker with live ammunition in it.
What they discover will restore Derry's lost place in the history of World War II.
The Battle of the Atlantic could not have been won if the bases on the Foyle had not been available to the Allies.
The residents of Derry had been on the front line, so this is an opportunity for them to see the U-boat gotten rid of.
And over 70 years later, the generation who witnessed firsthand this extraordinary time in Derry shared their experiences.
He was so badly injured. His body was covered in splinters.
To me, this was part of the U-boat nearly coming alive, you know.
The dancing and the courting and coming home with boys.
I feel like I want to take him out of the screen and give him a hug.
All you think about was what the people back home will think when they know I'm dead.
In this series, we'll dive back through history to uncover how one city helped forge victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Late 1941. Derry had spent 2 years on the battle's front line and had seen the Germans hammer Allied shipping. In just 3 months that year, their U-boats sank more than 280 ships off the northern Irish coast. But the Allies were determined to fight back. Warships crammed the Foyle, and Derry filled with 30,000 British, Canadian and American military personnel. The residents of Derry found themselves living in extraordinary times. The U-boats had brought the battle right to their doorstep. The people of this city came face to face with the tragedy and reality of World War II. But they dug deep and they got stuck in. Northern Ireland's war effort brought full employment to Derry as the demand for exports increased. For the women, this meant new jobs making ammunition, linen and uniforms.
When you were in the factory and you all sort of went down for a smoke, it was all, where did you go last night and who did you come home with? And every morning we had music while you work, and so life was good.
There may have been hardships, but Derry's men and women met these with cheery resourcefulness.
You couldn't get sugar, sweets, cigarettes were very scarce.
Rationing was pretty strict, but Donegal wasn't that far away.
Oh, smuggling was big, especially across the border.
My mother and them had down there fine art. They got the train in John Street and they had bags under their skirts and they did quite a lot of smuggling, I'm telling you.
And the presence of thousands of international troops in the city brought its own advantages.
American soldiers, they were terribly kind, and they used to wander around and talk to the children and give the children sweets and maybe hand out cigarettes and things. The same American used to appear every so often when the ship was in, and one day he brought us a banana. And they were absolutely, you never knew what they were, but we auctioned it and got £3 for it in the middle of the war.
Between all that and the dancing and the courting and coming home with boys, and if they got too fresh, you just took your heels and away you went because you were afraid of your mother. I must say, I thoroughly enjoyed the war.
There may have been good times in Derry, but there was no escaping the grim reality of a city and a world at war.
I remember going to dances at the Strand Picture House above it on a Saturday night with the girls out of the office and Joey Glover, whose father was a chemist in William Street. and he went away with the RAF, and he was shot down, and he would only have been about 19, I suppose.
In military campaigns around the world, young men were losing their lives. But nowhere more so than in the Battle of the Atlantic, where 100,000 were killed. At its crux were military supplies. Every week, huge convoys of cargo ships loaded with weaponry, oil and food left the United States and Canada. Without them, the Allied war effort in Europe would grind to a halt. So Germany sent its U-boat fleet to sink the convoys before they reached their destinations. Underwater explorer Ian Lawler and his team of expert divers are searching for lost wrecks of the battle.
I can see the U-boat.
They've already found the remains of a corvette, a warship still loaded with ammunition.
It really is much more of a jigsaw puzzle than I expected.
World naval experts Dr. Randy Papadopoulos and Dr. Axel Niesler are on hand to unlock the secrets of the wrecks.
The acoustic homing torpedo would have targeted the loud engines of the corvette and essentially would have blown her stern off.
Dozens of corvettes like this one moored up in Derry. Their job, to escort the convoys across the Atlantic and protect them from the U-boats, which were deadly, as the team revealed when they discovered the wrecks of 2 German submarines. First, U-1003.
Very capable fighting machines and very dangerous to the Allied shipping.
Then U-155, a notorious sub that claimed the lives of nearly 1,000 men.
During a war, all of these things are forgotten about, they're just incidental. But it's generally the divers that start to make the discoveries and that try and shed light on what happened. When you find what you're looking for, that really makes it all worthwhile.
The wrecks also revealed Derry's role in the conflict. As Britain's most westerly port, it was essential, a key naval base for the armed escorts. It was the battle's front line, and the city's hospitals were the first chance for the wounded to get life-saving treatment. Lexi Edgar was a nurse who volunteered with the St John's ambulance. He met the battle-scarred convoys at Lough Foyle and rushed their injured crews to hospital.
We went down to Moville, where the heavy cruiser was, protecting against submarines. And we took the injured people off into smaller boats and brought them up to the Foyle. Any injuries we could help out with, we gave them, dressed them up. Where they were more severely injured, we sent them off to city and county. I remember having to travel down and help a chap back. He was so badly injured. He was strapped from head to toe, and there wasn't a big lot of left of him. His body, as I say, was covered in splinters.
Lexi and his colleagues kept a logbook of the real human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic. On the face of it, this is a fairly simple record. 3 columns, the date, the name of the ship, and the number of passengers and crew that Lexi actually treated that came off it. And it does begin to tell you a fairly detailed story as to the growing human cost and human tragedy that was unfolding across the Atlantic. Broadly speaking, each page covers about 5 or 6 months, and as it goes through the war, the numbers tell the story. Page 1, he's treated 432 individuals. Here, 470, 555. Moving into 1943, 490. When you add it all together, you get a total of 3,401 recorded throughout the war. And on the back of this is an interesting list of the sorts of cases that Lexi was treating. Fractured spine, fractured skull, concussion, machine gun wounds, bullet wounds, burns, of course, from the burning oil when a ship sank, and, as you would expect, pneumonia. It's a simple book. When he wrote this, he never would have expected that this would become an important historic document, but it is. The injured who made it to Derry for treatment were the lucky ones. 100,000 never came home from the battle. 4,000 shipwrecks on the Atlantic seabed remind us of their sacrifice. Adding to the deadly threat of the U-boats was the Atlantic weather. High winds and violent seas could be deadly. For underwater explorer Ian Lawler and his team of divers, it's no different. It's September and they're on the Roskill Peninsula in North Donegal, hoping to dive a wreck 20 miles offshore. But today's rough seas could make it too dangerous.
It's not looking good.
No.
You're trying to stagger around in a pair of fins on the back of a rolling boat with the equivalent of your own body weight in your back. And the boat's doing, literally rising and falling 1 metre to 2 metres. That is not an option. You sort of remove people's heads. With the best skipper in the world, the best will in the world, that is very dangerous. Anybody gets it wrong through inattention or a mistake, you can be seriously injured.
Skipper Michael goes to check conditions one last time, but the weather has got worse. Even the sheltered waters of the bay are looking choppy.
The day's lost. Gone. Nothing.
Deepwater veteran and dive supervisor Rich Stevenson is in charge of safety and used to assessing the dangers of an expedition.
It's a force of nature, isn't it? The wind, when you can't stand up against something you can't see. You've got to pit your wits against the weather and everything else that you're up against as well.
You could just topple over at a moment's notice. It's just unthinkable to try and dive in these conditions.
It's a reminder of the bravery of the Atlantic crews who fought on whatever the weather.
Very aware of the historical significance of this area of water and what lies beneath the waves. You can't even imagine what it must be like to be caught out in the open ocean in those conditions.
But weather like this, and worse, was a fact of life for men working the Atlantic convoy routes. The busiest of them all passed through some of the Atlantic's wildest water, from Newfoundland in Canada to Derry. Over the war, it introduced thousands of Canadian sailors to the city.
The Royal Canadian Navy, which had been a very, very small, just a coastal patrol service at the beginning of the war, burgeons to the point where by 1943 it's the third largest navy in the world. If you look at the 100 plus escort ships that are based on the Foyle, the vast majority of them are Royal Canadian Navy.
To Canadian sailors, the route was legendary, known as the Newfie-Derry Run. 18-year-old Gilbert Davis was a stoker on the Canadian escort ship Meritonia. Wherever he went, he brought his camera.
The camera was a small camera. It was just a $1.50 camera. It was one of the first things he ever bought.
But Gilbert put it to good use, documenting his life during the Battle of the Atlantic, and not just at sea. Every month he spent time in Derry, and his pictures give a sailor's view of the city. Approaching the packed docks from the Foyle, the Allied escort ships moored 4 deep, and wartime Bishopsgate.
One place that struck Gilbert as a unique spot in Londonderry was Bishopsgate, because he understood that it was built sometime in the 16th century. That kind of history he hadn't seen over in North America.
Just like all Atlantic crews, Gilbert arrived in Derry with relief. It marked the end of another perilous crossing, not only giving the U-boats the slip, but also surviving the high seas and violent winds of the Atlantic.
The North Atlantic has some of the most unforgiving sea on the planet, really. That makes it very difficult to have any sort of cargo or naval operation take place.
Gilbert's photos showed the rough seas the Atlantic crews faced. With the ships rolling in giant swells, corvettes like Gilbert's still had to attempt essential tasks like refueling on the move.
Mountains of water, 30, 40, 60 feet high, and he would be hunkered down as close as he could to the security of the ship itself.
The Atlantic can be savage, but wild weather was always preferable to an encounter with a submarine. There was always the threat of attack from a U-boat. That itself must have frayed the nerves of many a crewman. And here we have an example of the aftermath. Clearly a tanker has been hit. The ship itself is obscured in billowing clouds of black, acrid smoke, and the sea all around it ablaze. The tanker had been carrying thousands of tons of fuel.
He was on the bow of the ship taking photographs. He said he had to hold his hand up and guard his face from the heat. It was so intense.
On the horizon is the tanker burning, and here alongside the hull of his ship, one man, the only survivor from that attack. Dwarfed by the tower of smoke and the vast Atlantic, this man had suffered horrific injuries.
They pulled him aboard the Maritonia, and as he was pulled from the water by a seaman, all of the skin from his arm had pulled off because he was so badly burned.
Over 70 years later, the pictures taken by Gilbert Davis give a remarkable insight into the reality of a sailor's life fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. It's one man's record of a campaign that cost the lives of thousands more. The dive team are getting ready for their 4th expedition. They're hoping to uncover the wreck of a U-boat Ian believes was sunk in the heat of battle just 10 miles from Coleraine. But on the Roskill Peninsula, another storm is brewing. The team are hoping to beat the incoming weather by heading for Port Stewart and diving from there.
Not sure just yet. This large area of Donegal could give us a bit of shelter. That would be a lot better. It is a narrow weather window, but it's an option.
They plan to use a high-speed rib to race out to the wreck and back again before the winds hit.
I think it gives us some advantages in certainly speed getting out there, but maybe less home comforts.
It's quite a stable boat, but you have to hang on.
The team has allowed just 30 minutes to get to the dive site, and already the winds are picking up. The high-speed twin-engine rib has to battle through the swell, while the team do their best to hang on. With the weather closing in, there isn't a minute to lose. Once on site, it's straight into the water. The strong surface swell sweeps the divers from the boat. Once underwater, they locate the grapple line. It should lead them 200 feet straight down directly to the wreck on the seabed. But the strong current has ripped the grapple off the wreckage, leaving them searching blindly through the silt. But then, the beam from a torchlight falls on the rusting hull of a U-boat. It's over 250 feet long and shows all the hallmarks of a Type 7, the workhorse of the German fleet. But what intrigues the team is the damage to the hull. Along its entire length, it's been shattered, the thick steel ripped open. This wreck shows all the telltale signs of a devastating depth charge attack. Having had just 20 minutes to gather the evidence they need, the team now make a controlled 2-hour ascent back to their boat. As they pile aboard, Ian can't contain his excitement at what he's seen.
Absolutely blasted. There's at least four depth charge hits.
The extensive damage to the U-boat is the first sign that the enormous efforts in Derry to win the Battle of the Atlantic were paying off. In 1941, the Allies sank just 40 U-boats. In 1943, they sank 270. But with so many German submarines sunk, it could be difficult for naval experts Randy Papadopoulos and Axel Niesler to identify the wreck Ian and the team have found.
This is there's a pretty jagged hole here. And it's all the plate is pushed in.
Inward.
Yeah.
The pushed-in plating that we're seeing here suggests that something came in from the outside, an explosion, probably.
Well, that's heavy structural damage.
Yeah.
This is simply crushed.
And here we are on the broken end of the snorkel.
Oh, yeah.
And then the conning tower area is devastated, absolutely demolished.
This is quite cataclysmic damage.
So that needs a depth charge.
Yes.
Exploding almost on contact.
Hundreds of pounds of explosives. Yeah.
Depth charges were the most common anti-submarine weapon. Once Allied ships had detected a U-boat, they would target depth charges over the entire area. The shockwaves created by the explosions could tear open the hull of a U-boat lurking beneath the surface.
But you see the thickness of the steel, it's just been torn like paper.
Yep.
The Royal Navy named it tin opener attacks.
Yes.
And that's exactly what has happened, obviously, to this wreck.
Axel and Randy used the location of the wreck and the knowledge it was pummeled by depth charges to search naval records for information to identify it. At last, they find a match.
From what we know, I think we can surely say that this is 1014. All what we have found here is consistent with that identification.
Ian and the team's dive has revealed the wreck as U1014, a late war Type 7 submarine. It was just 18 days into its first patrol when a group of British escort ships detected it 8 miles off the coast of Northern Ireland. They fell into formation and together began to hunt it down.
It's a bit of a ballet of ships, if you will, all the time moving because the U-boat, in addition, is trying to escape, and all of these ships are trying to keep in contact with it and put the ordnance where it's needed. So when they come across a contact, the first thing you do is start trying to pulverize it with as many depth charges or hedgehog or squid, whatever weapons they've got available, and make sure you've gotten it, rather than take a chance and let it get away.
Yeah. It was finally destroyed while being under the water.
Beneath the surface, the Allied depth charges found their target. All 48 men inside U1014 were killed. From 1943, German losses like this were increasingly common as the scales began to tip in the Allies' favour.
But it's just one more reminder to the U-boat crews that are still surviving that actually their time is going to be limited because their losses are just simply unsustainable.
As the German Kriegsmarine lost more and more of its crews, it became harder and harder to replace them with experienced men. Most of the crew on U1014 were younger than 22.
These were green soldiers sent out into a battle against an enemy which was gaining experience every day.
This is the Allied navies at the top of the anti-submarine warfare game, with tactics customized to deal with the inshore threat.
The crew of the British escort ships had no idea which U-boat they had sunk. They searched the wreckage that floated to the surface for anything that might identify their victim. One everyday item gave them a clue.
From the debris picked up after the attack, there were a pair of underpants picked up with a name on it. And this name was Moose.
By searching German naval records, Axel has been able to reveal that Seaman Moose was a 19-year-old engine mechanic and that his last recorded patrol was on board U1014.
So this is just another support that the boat being lost in this area is 1014.
Identifying the wreck is another success for Ian and the team, another name to add to his chart. But their discovery also marks the war grave of 48 young submariners. It reveals how the Allies' determination to keep the convoy routes open, alongside their growing expertise in hunting submarines, was now beginning to overpower the German U-boat fleet. The Allies may at last have been turning the Battle of the Atlantic in their favour, but one fatal chink remained: fully effective air cover. From 1940, Allied airplanes patrolled parts of the Atlantic, flying from coastal bases in Canada, Iceland and Northern Ireland.
Whenever a U-boat sees an airplane, the first temptation for that U-boat commander is to dive.
Once you've forced him below the water, he's reduced to about 4 to 7 knots. So it's a brisk walk or a slow trot, but it's certainly slower than even the slow convoys, which are travelling at about 9 or 10 knots.
It means that he cannot pursue the convoy anywhere near as effectively. His visibility is hindered, at the very least. But at best, it means that the U-boat will have to break off its contact with the convoy and won't be able to pursue it and hunt it any longer.
But the aeroplanes had limited range, and a vast area of the Atlantic remained unprotected from the air. This was known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, And for the Germans, the lack of air cover here made it a prime hunting ground. It was a gap the Allies needed to close. So the Royal Navy set about creating the largest air squadron in the UK, and they based it here in Derry. It was a decision that would change the course of the battle. The plan was for Swordfish biplanes to fly from Maydown at the edge of the city, land on makeshift aircraft carriers off the coast, and for the first time accompany the convoys to fly anti-U-boat patrols in the mid-Atlantic. Eventually, 100 of these planes operated from Derry's new airbase.
We're stepping onto the runways of HMS Shrike, and if you'd been here 70 years ago, amid the noise and the bustle and so forth, you might have been able to see 3 or 4 Swordfish biplane bombers taking off here on the westerly runway, heading out towards Donegal, and then turning out into the Atlantic, where they would join a small merchant aircraft carrier.
The merchant aircraft carriers, or MAC ships, were simply cargo vessels with their superstructure removed and a few hundred feet of runway welded on instead. They may have been crude, but with their Swordfish biplanes, these MAC ships proved highly effective.
These are very important because they'll provide each convoy with its own aircraft carrier protection.
Right from the very beginning of this airfield's existence as a naval base in May of 1943, to see the Battle of the Atlantic swing in the Allies' favour. And from then on, every convoy is covered by Swordfish, and basically the U-boats daren't operate on the surface anymore.
Bob Lee was a telegraphist air gunner with the Swordfish crews based in Derry. He flew every day, in any weather, standing in the open cockpit at the rear of the Swordfish.
And cold, I don't know why it was always cold, but it would seem to be the worst where we were, you know, in Canada or in Northern Ireland. It was always damn cold.
Bob faced danger too, every day. Just landing a Swordfish on an improvised aircraft carrier was a hit-and-miss affair. More than once, he found himself in the drink.
He started to dip down, and I thought, something wrong here, what's up, you know. And the pilot was pumping, and I thought, something wrong, mayday, 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 this is Swordfish, LS246, bosh. And then I heard, all right, 246, coming to land, you're clear. I thought he'd got the wrong bloody aircraft.
Bob's Swordfish had been given the wrong instructions. His plane overshot the landing deck of the aircraft carrier and smashed into the sea. But, as was the rule, the convoy didn't stop. Bob was left behind.
If the whole group of ships stops, that whole 40-ship target is a target. The Commodore has no choice but to keep going and let them go. And a lot of them perish because they can't have an immediate rescue come to them. It's a very risky business, not easy to manage, and it costs a lot of people their lives when things go wrong.
Bob was left adrift in the cold Atlantic, clinging to the wreckage of his biplane as the convoy steamed on.
After about half an hour, along came another Swordfish, dropped a couple of dinghies, which still didn't work, and I thought, that's it. They talk about your whole life flashing before you, and all you think about it was what the people back home will think when they know I'm dead. That was it.
Bob was eventually rescued by an escort ship, but he continued to fly, clocking up over 200 hours in the air. It was a crucial job, and Bob and his fellow crews at Maydown succeeded in forcing the U-boats to remain submerged.
The availability of those aircraft from mid-1943 onwards in every convoy meant that there was no part of the ocean that was safe as far as the U-boats were concerned from the eyes of Allied airmen in the sky above.
The Swordfish were the vital missing piece of the anti-U-boat strategy, and Maydown became critical to keeping the mid-Atlantic gap closed. The base quickly grew in size, with 2 British and Dutch air squadrons operating from here over the war. One RAF Wren who experienced how cosmopolitan life at Maydown became was Mary Piper.
It was the Women's Royal Naval Service, so that's why she was here, because of the convoys.
She did a lot of the organising of social events and entertainment. She looked after menus for different functions and so forth. So I think there was a party that she was organising, and she invited some of the men from the officers from Dad's 860 squadron.
860 squadron was made up entirely of Dutch aircrew who had fled Holland after the Nazi invasion. One of them was Hugo Yelema, a young flight navigator.
She always said that she first saw Dad at the top of the stairs, and she thought, he looks okay, or some such thing. Oh, I feel starry-eyed.
Both Hugo and Mary kept scrapbooks of their time in the war. These record their blossoming romance, as well as daily life at Maydown. Their daughters only recently discovered them in an attic.
So she's gathered all sorts of things. I mean, there's a picture of a band. Boy, did they play Take the Train well.
Oh, there's a dinner dance, a never-to-be-forgotten night at the club with Hugo. Back to Belmont in the pouring rain in evening dress.
Oh, wow. I think there was quite a lot of socialising going on. They had to take their mind off the serious stuff.
Mum was working in the Wrens, and Dad was back and forth, flying all the time.
Yeah.
So
looks from this that they were together a lot, but I think actually they weren't together that often because Dad was out supporting the convoys, flying as ferry swordfish backwards and forwards across the Atlantic. So, and each of those trips I think took 3 weeks. Oh, look at this one. Just arrived, received your letter, no leave permitted. Any chance of seeing you? Oh, how sweet. Dad was really very fortunate. I mean, he did all these things and he had hairy experiences, but I mean, he tells of other people who were not as lucky as he was. He came.
Some of them didn't.
A rediscovered wartime film of their dad's plane about to land on a Mac ship gives the sisters an insight into his bravery.
Oh my goodness. Looks like they missed that time. Oh,
and then, so Dad's telling the pilot how to come down?
Yes.
You know, left a bit, right a bit.
Yeah, because the pilot couldn't see. This is him. No, they're trying to land. Oh my goodness. Oh, down a bit, up a bit.
What a dangerous job that is.
I know, because he nearly gets his head cut off with the wings. Oh, safely down. Oh, there they are.
I mean, Dad must have only been about 19 there.
Yes. We're ditching a crashed plane. Oh, how relieved they must be to actually get on, get out of the plane.
One.
Mum must have been quite nervous and anxious about him all that time he was away. It was a very hazardous thing to do. Dad and his mates larking around. That's it. They were pretending that, you know, they had to be mad to do this job, so they were kind of all twitching.
Oh, that's the Batman.
Oh, yes. And what are they doing?
It must have been a sunny day. They're out on the deck.
Well, I know, that's what I was thinking. Mid-Atlantic, I was surprised that they would be out sunbathing. Oh, there's Dad. Oh, my goodness.
He's chewing gum.
Oh,
they're
wow.
horsing about because they're...
Oh, wow.
70 years later, this forgotten archive shows a young man still in his teens trying to lead an ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances.
It's absolutely gorgeous to see, and I feel like I want to take him out of the screen and give him a hug.
Hugo Yelema crossed the Atlantic many times and had many narrow escapes, but he survived the war, not to return to his native Holland, but to marry his Northern Irish love, Mary Piper. They lived the rest of their lives together in Belfast.
Yeah, so
very emotional to watch that, really.
It was terrific.
Very
Very
special.
lucky to have it.
Very special.
The dive team is back on the Roskill Peninsula, continuing their mission to map the lost wrecks of the Battle of the Atlantic. Today they're hunting another U-boat, and this time Ian already has a hunch which one it might be. As they head out, he shares his thoughts with the team.
And what number have you assigned to this one?
1104.
1104.
What type of sub is the 1104?
Type 7C.
It's 7C.
The dive will confirm whether Ian's right, but with a heavy swell developing, the divers waste no time kitting up and dropping over the side. "190 feet from the surface, they have enough light to pierce straight down the conning tower into the control room. This is where a German U-boat commander would once have stood and planned his attack. The conning tower shows no damage, and the periscopes are still intact. The U-boat appears to be in good condition. But just a few yards further on, the hull comes to a sudden stop. It's as if the U-boat has been snapped perfectly in two. Why, however, remains a mystery. The team search for clues to explain what happened and find no answers. But as Ian heads for the surface, one thing is clear. He thought this was U-1104, a Type 7 U-boat. He was completely wrong.
I said, hang on a second, this is too big. This is just way too big. It's not a Type 7C Atlantic, it's definitely a Type 9. Start again.
It's a double mystery for the team. Which U-boat is it? And how was it broken so cleanly in half?
I can't imagine she ruptured or somebody fired a shell at it or whatever. It's a very clean break. Whoever did the blasting job on that had to work it off, I think.
It sort of adds to the whole sort of confusion of what it is. So I think back to the drawing board.
So will naval experts Dr. Randy Papadopoulos and Dr. Axel Niesler be able to shed light on the mystery U-boat?
No, I looked at it and went, no, this is not what I was expecting.
Well, from everything we see right now, it's definitely not the Type 7C.
Yeah.
Because the deck is simply too wide.
Yeah.
So this is the aft end of the pressure hull.
Yes.
There should be two openings in it for the two aft torpedo tubes.
Here we go, one.
1, 2. So
two.
Aha.
This at least solves the mystery for the type
The class,
of this
yeah.
U-boat. It's a Type 9.
Yeah.
So this wreck is broken completely in half.
We'll just see the damage here.
Ian shows the two experts the extraordinary break in the U-boat's hull. It's unlike anything they've seen before.
Just look at how clean this is.
That's amazing.
Absolutely extraordinary.
It's all along one of these pressure hull frames here.
Yes. It's like somebody sliced it off with a cleaver.
Yeah.
But with only half a wreck, it's difficult for Axel and Randy to make a precise ID. Only the U-boat's type and its location are certain. So they scour German and British files for records of any Type 9 sunk in the area. And at last, they find a likely match.
Now, you've been studying the wreck of the infamously named U-Broken, effectively half a U-boat. Any clues as to what kind of a boat it was and what happened to it?
At the moment, we just can speculate that it is probably U-541, which, according to the records, had gone down close to this location.
What could have caused that to happen? Presumably something like a torpedo.
If a torpedo explodes underneath, of course, it will lift up the whole boat bodily and will be able certainly to break it in part. But according to the records, this boat was not torpedoed.
So what did cause this unusual damage? In attempting to solve one mystery, the team have stumbled on another. But from only half a U-boat, they have made a likely identification. U-541. This submarine opens the final chapter in Derry's wartime story. After Britain defeated the German armies in Europe in 1945, the U-boat fleet was ordered to surrender. and over 100 submarines assembled on the River Foyle. Victory was made official when the German crews handed over their boats and were taken ashore as prisoners of war.
That happened on the 14th of May 1945 when a flotilla of about 8 U-boats came in. They made their formal surrender on the jetty at Lissahalli and formally brought the Battle of the Atlantic to an end.
For the entire war, Derry had battled the U-boat. Now they were moored in the city. Locals did everything they could, not just to see one, but to get on board.
The uncle, he managed to get me on one of the U-boats. You could hardly move in them, they were that bloody tight. They were very cramped. You'd wonder how people could have lived in them, especially under the water.
But the real prize was to get your hands on a souvenir. And soon Derry was awash with U-boat memorabilia.
Everybody in Derry had something of the U-boats. Everybody could show you something that come off the U-boats. I had a friend down the street who had an identity book for one of the officers in one of the submarines. My uncle got an officer's jacket off one of the submarines, and his brother-in-law ended up wearing it ploughing fields down at Malin Head, you know. Everybody going to school, you went in with something, everybody liked to show it.
Dermot and his uncle managed to swipe a naval chart from one of the U-boats, and ever since he was a little boy, he's kept it safe.
It was my great treasured possession for a long time, you know, showing everybody it. You will see that they have penciled in every lighthouse around the coast of Ireland. This is where they seem to zigzag, perhaps waiting for some ship coming their way, you know. To me, this was part of the U-boat nearly coming alive, you know.
But there was more to this surrender than a formal handover at the dockside. As part of Operation Deadlight, the U-boat fleet was towed out to sea and sunk, one by one. U-541 was just one of over 100 U-boats deliberately destroyed off the Northern Irish coast.
The idea, presumably, to put these boats out of reach for all time.
Prime driver for this, frankly, is the Royal Navy, which wants to make sure that nobody gets a free supply of submarines with which it might attack British commerce in the future, an enemy unspecified.
Operation Deadlight was a dramatic and very public display of victory, and the decision for it all to unfold in Derry was no accident. It was a formal tribute to the efforts made in the city to help win the Battle of the Atlantic.
Admiral Sir Max Horton chose the location for that to be Lissahalli, marking the significance of the Foyle in the battle against the U-boats. Here, after almost 6 years of struggle, it all ended.
For a city like Derry, which had very much been at the forefront of the Battle of the Atlantic, there was some justice in this scene unfolding on its river.
Absolutely. The residents of Derry had been on the front line, so in fact this is an opportunity for them to see the U-boat that had made their city important to the Allied war effort during the Second World War. Now that threat is going to be literally gotten rid of. I think that symbolism gives the residents of Derry, and indeed the broader world, an idea that the Battle of the Atlantic really is over. I think that must have given a real sense of finality to the people who were watching and those who got to see newsreels describing it.
This news from the front line of the battle was what the world had been longing for. There were celebrations across the globe, and Derry was no different.
When the word came that the war was over, everybody stopped work. And everybody was through the night. They were dancing and singing and drinking and everything I want.
The King and Queen made the trip to Derry to congratulate and thank both the city and the Atlantic crews for their role in the Allied victory.
All the celebrations were fantastic. I mean, they were dancing on the streets. The pianos were out. Everybody was out. I mean, I have that photograph of the one on our street, in Albert Street. Even my granny was there, and there were so many children, and it was so exciting, and the bells were ringing, and everybody was happy. Everybody really was happy that the war was over.
The Battle of the Atlantic had been won. But there is one final secret on the seabed that reveals how victory came in the nick of time. When Germany surrendered, they were only weeks away from launching a brand new fleet of revolutionary super subs. Deadly vessels German scientists believe would turn the battle and the war back in their favour. The Type 21 electro boat. The team is now on the hunt for Hitler's deadliest submarine. They're excited at the thought of seeing this legendary U-boat with their own eyes and exploring the wonders of its technology.
Okay, any questions from anyone? That's good. Let's get in the water then.
That's it, shots in, whenever you're ready.
The sunken wrecks of only 2 operational electro boats exist anywhere in the world, and now our team are right above one of them. "210 feet below the surface, they get their first glimpse of Hitler's secret weapon. It was over 250 feet long and weighed more than 2,000 tons. It was faster underwater than escort ships on the surface and was capable of outrunning and outmanoeuvring any convoy. It could detect the sound of an enemy vessel from more than 30 miles away and could fire 18 torpedoes in 20 minutes, 3 times faster than its predecessors. It was the perfect naval predator. And her sheer scale leaves the team awestruck.
You see just how deep and how big the hull of the submarine is. It's just a scale thing. I mean, it makes the Type 7s look like tiddlers. It's just something else. It's amazing to see.
100,000 men died in the Battle of the Atlantic. Historians can only imagine how many more thousands of lives might have been lost if the electroboat fleet had been allowed to enter the fight in significant numbers.
The Type 21 was a game changer, completely. You can see there the full transition from basically a glorified torpedo boat you can stick underwater to a totally hydrodynamically designed underwater fighting machine.
It's fantastic to see such a beautiful streamlined wreck. It's beautiful in that it's ahead of its time. It was really the birth of the modern submarine, and you just can't ask for better than that. It stays in your memory forever, really.
The divers have revealed an extraordinary wreck, one of the legends of World War II, submerged just 20 miles off the north coast of Ireland. For Axel and Randy, the footage of the wreck is an exciting chance to study in detail a revolutionary secret weapon, one that symbolises both the deadly threat of the German U-boat and the wonders of its technology.
That's something what has fascinated the people over the last 60 years. And here is the real thing, the actual U-boat. It's not just a blueprint or a picture. It's a U-boat mostly in its original fitting out status. This is the father of all the modern submarines.
It's a nice piece of history to have out there and really completes the story of the U-boat in the Second World War.
This, actually for the first time, is a proper submarine, something designed from the outset to spend most of its time underwater.
This type is designed for total underwater warfare.
It reminds us that the Allies could never really take their eye off the ball. They had to prosecute the campaign against the U-boats right till the very end.
Absolutely, and from the perspective of the Allies, the development of the Type 21 U-boat is something they know about. They've captured U-boat crew members who've seen these U-boats under construction and seen them in workups, and they get very concerned about them. That raises the priority for attacking the shipyards and destroying the U-boats at their source.
Throughout 1944, the Germans did everything they could to fast-track the new electroboats into production. Assembled in sections, they could build a single Type 21 in just 8 weeks. To the Allies, it was clear they had to destroy these deadly vessels before they could be deployed in the Atlantic.
For example, in a single daylight attack, they were able to destroy or damage almost a dozen of these boats, still on the building slips.
Wave after wave of Allied bombers hammered the Type 21s in the boatyards. Within months, nearly the entire fleet was destroyed. They were Hitler's deadliest U-boats, but only 2 ever made it into active service, and neither fired a single torpedo before surrendering. Now, just off the Northern Irish coast, the team has revealed the resting place of the last of these lethal machines, sent to the bottom during Operation Deadlight.
History, of course, is full of what-ifs. But the question I'm going to ask you is, if the war had been prolonged for whatever reason, and these boats had really taken a hold and their numbers had grown, it would have potentially had a disastrous effect on the ongoing campaign.
Had the conflict lasted 1 or 2 months longer, a fairly large number of these boats would have appeared in the Atlantic. And certainly the sinking figures would have risen to unheard dimensions.
All of the historians say it wouldn't have caused the war to be lost, but it certainly would have made it a hell of a lot longer. And you go away from that wondering what might have been. And the Battle of the Atlantic would have been a much longer and even more bloody, for a very bloody conflict.
Ian's mission to map the lost wrecks of the Battle of the Atlantic has unlocked the story of history's longest, most epic naval campaign.
That dive was just the best way to end what has been the real challenge, so it makes it all utterly worthwhile. It's worth getting his that. It's just fantastic, man,
And the team has succeeded in uncovering forgotten wrecks, revealing technology and tactics of the mightiest of sea battles.
Where else would your eye be?
Sobering, to think that all this went off, on a lovely calm evening like this. It's sobering to think of it all happening out here. There's always a story.
The waters off Northern Ireland's coast have at last revealed the secrets of the forgotten wrecks on the ocean floor.
Even after more than 60 years on the seabed, they still are able to give off some secrets. There's still something we can learn.
The wrecks tell the story of 37,000 Allied sailors, 36,000 merchant seamen, and 30,000 German submariners. Men who all lost their lives in the Atlantic in the fog of war. And at the heart of the story, Derry. Transformed by its vital role in the Battle of the Atlantic and in the victory of the Second World War. A city with its own forgotten history. Its river filled with warships. Home to America's first European military base. To an underground command bunker. And home to the fight against the deadly U-boats. The men and women of Derry met the challenges of war head-on. Theirs is a city with a wartime heritage that deserves to be remembered and celebrated.
Trying to keep the memory alive, I think, is important, because when traces of all of this are gone, then something from our history and something from our collective memory goes as well.
Only fragments of this story remain. They should be treasured. The priceless wartime heritage of an historic city at the heart of an epic conflict.